welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I didn't have a word for it when I was 9, and I didn't need one. I just knew there were moments when my body felt like a loud object I was forced to carry through quiet rooms. I was a careful kid. The kind of careful that adults praise because it looks like maturity, but really it's just fear dressed up as good behavior. I learned early that people were always measuring you, even when they smiled, even when they were just teasing. I learned what laughter could do to you. And I learned that the safest way to move through the world was to be legible. My family was ordinary in the way most families are ordinary, loving in the ways they understood, blind in the ways they didn't. My father believed in work as a moral language. My mother believed in keeping things smooth. Neither of them said cruel things, not directly. But there were rules in our house that were never written down, and I absorbed them the way you absorb weather. Boys were supposed to be sturdy. Boys were supposed to be unbothered. Boys were supposed to want what boys wanted, and if you didn't, you were either lying or broken. It wasn't that they hated anyone. It was that they trusted the world's categories more than they trusted uncertainty. When I was 9, my cousin left a tote bag at our house after a holiday. It ended up in the laundry room, and one afternoon, when no one was home, I opened it the way you open a door you're not sure you're allowed to touch. Inside were a few folded things, soft, bright, and strangely quiet. A scarf that smelled like shampoo. A thin sweater. A pair of tights. I remember touching the tights with the back of my fingers first, like they might be hot. They weren't. They were cool and smooth, like water you could hold. I didn't put them on because I was trying to become anything. I put them on because curiosity is what a child has before shame arrives. The first time the fabric slid over my legs, I felt a kind of relief that surprised me, not because it was thrilling, but because it was calming. It felt like I had been wearing sandpaper without realizing it and someone had handed me something gentle. I stared at myself in the mirror and didn't see a joke. I saw a kid wrapped in something that made him feel safe for a second. Then I heard a car door outside and panic came in like a storm. I ripped everything off, shoved it back into the bag, and stood in the laundry room shaking like I'd almost been caught doing something criminal. That was the first lesson, that what made me feel calm might be treated as wrong. For years after that, I carried the memory in my pocket like a stone. I didn't think about it every day, but it was always there, pressing against other thoughts. When I was 12 and my voice started to change, I hated the way it cracked in front of people. When I was 13 and the other boys started to talk about girls like they were trophies, I pretended to understand. I learned how to laugh at the right time. I learned how to make my face do what it was expected to do. I learned how to be a good son and a good student and a good friend, and I became very skilled at doing what made other people comfortable. The thing about being skilled at that is you can lose track of what you actually feel. You become fluent in translation but forget your native language. In high school I found a name for what I'd done in the laundry room because the internet made it impossible for anything to remain unnamed. The word itself didn't help. It made it heavier. It came with stereotypes. It came with jokes. It came with videos that treated it like a stunt. And most of all, it came with the fear that I wasn't just a boy who had once liked the feeling of soft fabric, maybe I was the kind of person people pointed at. Maybe I was a problem. So I did what a lot of careful kids do, I tried to become unnoticeable in the exact shape I was supposed to be. I joined a sports team I didn't love. I deepened my voice on purpose. I wore the same kind of clothes as everyone else. I dated a girl and told myself that proved something, as if attraction was a courtroom and I needed evidence. I became a version of myself that could survive other people's certainty. But the truth doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It waits. It grows patient. It finds you in quieter moments. Sometimes it found me in stores when I walked past the women's section and felt a tug, not of desire, but of recognition, like seeing a color you'd forgotten existed. Sometimes it found me when I watched my mother get ready for a wedding and saw how she transformed not into someone else, but into a more intentional version of herself. I envied that. Not because it was feminine, but because it was chosen. There was agency in it. There was permission to be expressive. I didn't know how to ask for that without breaking the rules. By the time I went to college, I had built a life on being dependable. I was the friend who helped people move. The guy who remembered birthdays. The person professors liked because I met deadlines. Being responsible was my camouflage. It also meant I didn't know what to do when responsibility collided with honesty. That collision didn't happen all at once. It happened through one friendship, and then through one storm. I met my best friend in a way that felt almost too normal, in a crowded lecture hall, arguing quietly about a point the professor had made. He had that rare confidence that wasn't about dominance. He just didn't pretend. He said what he thought and adjusted when he was wrong. Being around him made me feel like I could breathe without constantly checking the air. We grew close in the ordinary ways: cheap food, late-night talks, shared stress during finals, long drives with too much music and not enough sleep. I spent weekends at his family's place sometimes, and that's where I met his sister. She was older than us by a few years, already an adult in the way that felt intimidating when I was still learning how to live away from home. She wasn't the stereotype people use when they talk about strong women. She didn't need to announce anything. She just existed with a steady kind of self-possession. She had a practical mind. She noticed details. She treated people like they were capable, and she didn't apologize for having boundaries. At first we were polite acquaintances, connected by my friendship with her brother. Over time, familiarity softened the edges. We were in the same orbit enough that casual conversations became real ones. We talked about work, about family expectations, about how adulthood isn't a switch that flips but a series of decisions you keep making. I came to trust her, not because she made me feel safe by being gentle, but because she made me feel safe by being consistent. Years later, after graduation, after I'd moved and taken a job that sounded good on paper but left me hollow by the end of each day, she asked me for a favor. It wasn't dramatic. It was a practical request wrapped in a casual message. She needed someone to help her check on a remote house her family still owned, a place that had been sitting mostly unused, because a caretaker had quit and the weather reports were starting to look ugly. Her brother, my best friend, had planned to go, but work had pinned him down at the last minute. She didn't want to go alone. Would I come? I said yes, too quickly, the way I always did when someone needed something. Part of me wanted to prove I was still the reliable friend. Part of me liked the idea of leaving my routine for a weekend. And part of me, though I didn't admit it at the time, liked the idea of being in a quiet place with someone who didn't let people hide behind easy answers. We drove out with the sky already heavy, the kind of gray that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The house was farther than I expected, tucked away on a road that narrowed into something half paved, half stubborn. When we arrived, the wind hit us like a warning. We unloaded quickly, laughing a little at the way the cold made everything feel urgent. Inside, the house was clean but stale, like it had been waiting too long. We turned on the heat, checked the pipes, went through the basic routine she'd come for. It felt like we would be in and out. Then the power flickered once, steadied, and flickered again. The wind grew teeth. Snow started as a polite drift and became an argument. By evening, the road was gone under white. We checked our phones and saw the same thing on both screens: warnings, closures, updates that sounded calm but meant danger. We called her brother to reassure him. We called the local line listed on the county's site. The answer was simple: stay put. Don't try to leave. We might not get plowed out for a while. I remember feeling that particular kind of fear that doesn't spike so much as settle. It's the fear of not being in control. The fear of waiting. We had food for a couple of days if we were careful. We had heat, at least for the moment. We had a working generator if the power went out. We had blankets. We had each other, which mattered more than I wanted to admit. The first night, the tension was mostly logistical. We made a list of supplies. We rationed what needed rationing. We agreed on chores without making it a big deal. She moved through decisions like someone who had practiced under pressure. I tried to match her calm, but inside I kept thinking about how quickly a weekend trip had become an unknown number of days. The second day, the power went out for good. The generator worked, but not well enough to pretend it was normal life. We used it in intervals to keep the fridge from turning into a problem and to warm the house in waves. The cold began creeping into the corners of rooms like a slow intruder. We wore layers. We kept moving. We stayed busy because stillness made room for worry. It was on that day we realized the luggage had gotten mixed up. It sounds like a small thing, the kind of detail that would be a punchline in a different kind of story. But in the reality of a storm, small things become big quickly. In our rush to unload, we'd grabbed bags without checking. Her suitcase, the one with the heavier winter clothes, had ended up in the back of the car under other things we hadn't wanted to leave exposed. My duffel, lighter, casual, was inside. When we finally got to her bag, we found it wasn't her bag at all. It was her brother's old travel bag, packed for a completely different trip months ago, gym clothes, a couple of thin shirts, socks that didn't fit anyone in that house, and nothing meant for a week of cold. Her clothes were in my duffel. I remember the moment we both looked at the contents. It wasn't awkward immediately. It was just strange. Her sweaters, her thermal leggings, her spare jeans, a few underlayers, practical things. Nothing dramatic. Nothing revealing. The awkwardness arrived a second later, when we both realized what the situation might require. She didn't make a joke. She didn't tease. She just sat on the floor with the clothes folded around her like a quiet problem and said, "Okay. We're going to get through this. But we need to be smart." I offered to give her everything and make do with the thin things we had, because that's what I thought responsibility meant, sacrifice, no questions asked. She looked at me the way you look at someone who's trying to be noble at the wrong time. "You'll get sick," she said. "And then we'll both be in trouble. I don't need a hero. I need a teammate." I said I could wear 2 jackets and sleep under more blankets. I said I'd be fine. I said a lot of things that were really just fear speaking. She paused, then said, carefully, "There's another option." The air felt suddenly very loud. I knew what she meant before she said it, and that knowledge made my chest tighten. "You can wear some of mine," she continued, still practical. "Not everything. Just what keeps you warm. The thermals, the thicker socks, the leggings under your pants. It's fabric. It doesn't have a gender in a storm." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to refuse so badly I could taste it. Not because I thought it was wrong, but because I knew what it would mean inside me. I knew it would touch something I had spent years keeping sealed. I had built a life on avoiding situations where I might have to answer questions I wasn't ready to answer. And yet she was right. The storm didn't care about my internal rules. The cold didn't care about my fear. If I got sick, it would be a real consequence, not a social one. It would put us both at risk. Responsibility wasn't about being the toughest person in the room. It was about making the choice that kept everyone safe. I nodded once, small, like I was agreeing to carry a heavy box. We did it with boundaries and normalcy. She turned away while I changed. She handed me pieces folded neatly, like medical supplies. She didn't laugh. She didn't watch. She didn't treat it like a secret thrill. She treated it like warmth. The first time I pulled on the thermal leggings, that old calm returned so fast it scared me. It wasn't excitement. It was recognition. The same softness I'd felt as a child. The same quiet. It felt like stepping into a room where my shoulders could drop. And then the shame arrived, because my brain had been trained to punish me for relief. I stood there in layers I didn't have words for, and I realized how much energy I'd spent in my life refusing comfort when it came in the wrong packaging. I didn't tell her any of that. I just said, "Thank you," and tried to sound normal. But she noticed something anyway. Not the details of what I was wearing, she hadn't looked, but the way my voice had shifted. The way my hands were unsteady. "You okay?" she asked. I said yes, too quickly. She waited, the way she always did, giving space for truth without demanding it. Then she said something that was both simple and startling: "You don't have to be embarrassed with me." I swallowed. I told myself not to make it bigger. I told myself to focus on survival. But the storm had trapped us in more than a house. It had trapped us in time. Days stretched. Silence grew longer. And the clothes, this practical solution, became a routine. The third day, the road was still buried. We used the generator sparingly. We read old books from shelves we hadn't noticed at first. We played cards. We listened to the radio for updates that didn't come. We checked the windows like it would change something. We moved furniture away from drafts. We made soup from what we had and tried to pretend it was just camping indoors. And I kept wearing her layers, because it was the smartest choice. At first, I did it with the mindset of borrowing tools. I told myself it was temporary. It meant nothing. It was survival. Then something happened that I didn't expect. The more routine it became, the less it felt like a costume and the more it felt like a mirror. When you put on someone else's clothing for practical reasons, you start noticing how the world is built. Not just how fabric fits, but how assumptions fit. I noticed that her clothes were designed around warmth and movement, but also around being observed. Seams that didn't chafe. Waistbands that sat differently. Pockets that were smaller, which made me irrationally annoyed for her on her behalf. Layers that could be adjusted to look presentable, because women are expected to remain presentable even when doing something as basic as staying warm. And because we were alone, because no one could see us, I got to feel what it was like to be in those clothes without the constant threat of being judged. The absence of witnesses made space for honesty. She didn't push me. Not in the way people imagine when they want a story to be dramatic. She didn't dare me. She didn't play games. But she did something more influential: she stayed calm about it. Every time I expected her to treat it like a big deal, she treated it like Tuesday. If I said, "I'll switch back to mine when the house warms," she'd say, "Sure," and then hand me another thick sweater because the house wasn't warming anytime soon. If I apologized, she'd say, "Stop apologizing for being cold." If I tensed up, she'd say, "Breathe. This isn't a test." On the fourth day, the storm quieted enough that the world outside looked frozen rather than violent. Still no way out, still no plow. The silence was worse because it made us think. That day we went through the closet for extra blankets and found a few things that changed the texture of the situation: a spare set of boots that fit me better than mine, a box of old winter gear, and, because life loves irony, a worn set of clothes that belonged to her mother from years ago, still neatly stored. She held up a cardigan and smiled, not amused, just tender. "My mom would laugh," she said. "Not at you. Just at the whole universe." I laughed too, and the laughter felt like release, not ridicule. Later that evening, as we sat near the generator's heat like it was a small campfire, she asked me something quietly, as if it mattered how the words landed. "Can I ask you something without you feeling cornered?" I nodded, already cornered by my own heart. "Is this only uncomfortable for you?" she asked. "Or is some part of it also familiar?" I stared at my hands. I could have lied. I had practice. I could have said it was just awkward, just practical, just whatever would end the conversation. But the storm had made me tired of performing. And her tone made it clear she wasn't hunting for gossip. She was offering a doorway. I said, "It's both." She waited. I took a long breath and told her, in pieces, about the laundry room when I was 9. About the years of hiding. About not knowing what it meant. About how I'd spent my life trying to be simple because complexity felt dangerous. I told her I didn't think I was someone else. I wasn't announcing a new identity like a headline. I was describing a quiet part of myself I'd refused to acknowledge. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "That makes a lot of sense." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they solved anything, but because they didn't punish me. I had been bracing for disgust or mockery or pity. Instead, I got understanding. "I don't want to pressure you," she added. And I'm not here to define you. But I do want you to know something. If you ever decide you want to explore this in a way that's respectful to yourself, safe, honest, not hidden in shame, that's allowed. You're allowed. Allowed. It was such a small word, but it rearranged the room inside me. The next days were less about clothes and more about conversations. We talked about how people learn to fear being seen. We talked about the difference between privacy and secrecy. We talked about mental health in a way that wasn't theoretical. I admitted that I'd been anxious for years, that I'd felt like I was always one mistake away from being exposed as not a real man, whatever that meant. She didn't diagnose me. She didn't label me. She suggested, gently, that I might benefit from talking to someone professionally, not because I was broken, but because I deserved support. At one point I confessed something that embarrassed me, that I didn't trust myself with this. That I worried if I allowed myself comfort, I would lose control, become reckless, ruin relationships, disappoint people. I said it like a confession. She said, control isn't the same as health. Avoidance feels like control until it becomes a cage. That line stayed with me long after the snow melted. When the plow finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. A rumble outside. A man in a heavy coat waving at us like we were characters in a story he'd heard before. We thanked him too many times. We loaded the car. We drove back through walls of snow that looked like the remains of something that had tried to erase the road. In the car, as the normal world returned to cell service, other vehicles, radio stations that weren't static, I felt a strange grief. Not because I wanted to be trapped again, but because being trapped had forced honesty. Freedom was going to offer me all my old hiding places back. She must have sensed it because she said, without looking at me, you don't have to decide everything right away. I asked her what she meant. I mean, she said, you don't have to turn this into a crisis. You can treat it like learning. Like you learned something about yourself. And now you get to choose what to do with that knowledge. When I got home, life was the same, but I wasn't. That was the hardest part. It's easy to change when the environment demands it. It's much harder to change when the environment invites you to pretend nothing happened. For a while, I tried to put the experience in a box labeled storm story. I told my best friend the funny parts, the power outage, the rationing, how his sister had run the whole operation like a competent general. I didn't tell him about the conversations. I didn't tell him what I'd worn. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust myself to survive his reaction, even if it was kind. The anxiety returned in a different shape. It wasn't just fear of being judged anymore. It was fear of losing the truth I'd touched. It was like I'd walked into sunlight and now the shadows felt sharper. I started reading, quietly, responsibly, not diving into extremes, just trying to understand. I learned that identity exploration doesn't have one pathway. I learned that clothing can mean many things: comfort, expression, experimentation, culture, rebellion, conformity. I learned that some people crossdress as a way to explore gender, some as a way to play with aesthetics, some as a private comfort, some as part of broader transitions, and many people don't fit neatly into any box. I learned that shame thrives on isolation. I also learned something humbling, that the world is full of people carrying invisible battles while still showing up for work, for family, for friends. That realization didn't make me special. It made me more empathetic. It made me less quick to assume I understood anyone's story just by looking at them. But education doesn't automatically create courage. I still had to make choices. I chose to talk to a therapist. The first session, I talked about stress at work, because that was the socially acceptable entry point. The second session, I talked about anxiety. By the third, I was sitting in a room that felt too bright, telling a stranger about a laundry room and a storm and a part of myself that felt both tender and dangerous. My therapist didn't react dramatically. That was, again, the gift. She asked about my feelings, not just the facts. She asked what I feared. She asked what I wanted. She asked how long I'd been carrying the belief that my comfort was suspicious. We worked on separating values from fear. We worked on the idea that self-exploration can be done ethically, without deceiving people, without using others, without making promises I couldn't keep. We talked about consent and boundaries in the broad life sense, about how I could be honest with future partners, how I could protect my privacy without living in secrecy, how I could respect social contexts without living like a spy. One of the most important things she helped me understand was this: my identity wasn't a single verdict waiting to be announced. It was a relationship with myself. And relationships require patience. I began taking small, non-dramatic steps. I bought clothes for myself, but not in a way that felt like a costume or a prank. Practical items first. Things that were comfortable, neutral, private. I paid attention to how it made me feel. If I felt calm, I let myself feel calm. If I felt ashamed, I tried not to punish myself for the shame. Shame, I learned, is often an echo of other people's rules. Sometimes I would put on those clothes at home and just do regular things: cook dinner, read, clean. I wanted to separate the experience from adrenaline. I wanted it to be normal, because normal is where truth can breathe. I also confronted another hard reality: secrecy had taught me to compartmentalize, and compartmentalization can make you careless. It can make you lie by omission. It can make you treat the people you love like obstacles. I didn't want to become that version of myself. So I made a plan for honesty. Not sudden, not reckless, but intentional. The first person I told, fully, clearly, was her. I asked if we could talk, and when we met for coffee, I told her what I'd been doing since the storm: therapy, reading, small steps. I told her I was grateful, but also that I was afraid of attaching too much meaning to her role in it. I didn't want to make her responsible for my identity. I didn't want to turn her kindness into a burden. She nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that. And I'm glad you're taking care of yourself." I told her I was considering telling her brother. My best friend. The thought made my stomach twist. She said, "He loves you. He might not understand immediately, but he's not cruel. And you're not doing anything wrong by learning who you are. Just give him time. And don't ask him to be perfect on the first try." That advice mattered because it acknowledged both truths: that love can coexist with confusion, and that I could demand respect without demanding instant comprehension. When I finally told him, it wasn't in a dramatic confession. It was in a quiet moment when we were already talking about life feeling heavy. I told him there was something personal I wanted him to know because I trusted him. I told him about the storm in a careful way, and about what it had opened in me. I didn't ask him to label me. I didn't ask him to solve me. I just asked him to listen. He sat back, silent, and I felt the old fear surge, my whole body preparing for impact. Then he said, "Okay." He rubbed his face. He laughed once, not mocking, just overwhelmed. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say." "You don't have to say anything perfect," I said, my voice shaking. "I just didn't want to hide it from you." He nodded slowly. "I'm surprised," he admitted. "But I'm not mad." "Are you okay?" That question, "Are you okay?" was everything. We talked for a long time. He asked questions that were awkward but sincere. I answered what I could. When I didn't know, I said I didn't know. We agreed on something important: that our friendship didn't depend on me fitting his expectations. It depended on trust. After that conversation, I noticed how much lighter daily life felt. Not because all fear vanished, but because one of my biggest secrets was no longer a private prison. I still didn't tell everyone. I didn't owe everyone my inner life. Privacy is not dishonesty. But I stopped living like exposure would destroy me. As time passed, the experience stopped being about clothes and became about integration. Integration, for me, meant letting different parts of myself coexist without declaring war on each other. It meant understanding that masculinity didn't have to be brittle. That I could be a man and still appreciate softness, still find comfort in different forms of expression, still reject the idea that strength requires rigidity. It meant learning that self-respect includes the way you talk to yourself when no one else is listening. It also meant taking responsibility for how my choices affected others. I learned to be honest with people I dated before things got serious. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with steady clarity. I learned to accept that not everyone would be comfortable, and that discomfort didn't automatically make them bad or me wrong. Sometimes it just meant we weren't compatible. I learned to walk away without bitterness. I learned that boundaries work both ways. There were consequences, too. I lost a relationship I'd hoped would last because the person couldn't reconcile the idea with their beliefs. It hurt. It also taught me that being loved conditionally is its own kind of loneliness. I faced moments at work where casual jokes about gender made me feel like I was swallowing glass. I didn't always speak up. Sometimes I did. Each time I did, even gently, it felt like reclaiming a small piece of my voice. The biggest change, though, was internal. The shame didn't disappear entirely, but it stopped running the whole show. When it rose, I learned to recognize it as a learned response, not a prophecy. I learned coping strategies that were simple but powerful: breathing, grounding, journaling, checking my thoughts for catastrophizing, reminding myself that I wasn't in danger just because I felt exposed. I learned to ask myself questions that were kinder than the ones I'd grown up with. What do I need right now? What choice aligns with my values? Am I acting from fear or from care? Sometimes I thought back to that storm and realized it had offered me a strange kind of education. It taught me that identity isn't only discovered in grand moments, it's discovered in the ordinary decisions you make when you're tired and cold and trying to do the right thing. It taught me that empathy can be as simple as someone refusing to mock you. It taught me that practical solutions can reveal emotional truths you didn't know you were starving for. Years after, I visited that house again, this time in summer, when the road was easy and the air smelled like pine and warm dust. My best friend came with me. We fixed a few things, cleaned a few rooms, talked about nothing important and everything important. At one point, he looked out the window and said, almost casually, "You know, I'm glad you told me. I'm still learning. But I'm glad I know you, not just the version of you that thinks it has to be invincible." I didn't answer right away because gratitude can feel like grief when you realize how long you went without it. Eventually I said, "Me too. I'm telling you all this not because I think everyone's story looks like mine, but because I know how lonely it can feel when you're trying to understand yourself in a world that prefers simple categories. If there's anything I've learned, it's that exploration doesn't have to be reckless, and it doesn't have to be hidden in shame. It can be thoughtful. It can be ethical. It can be grounded in self-respect and respect for others. And it can be accompanied by support of friends, professionals, communities, who treat you like a human being rather than a headline. I also learned that the goal isn't to become someone else. The goal is to become whole. For me, that wholeness looks like a life where I'm still dependable, still responsible, still trying to be kind, but no longer at war with the parts of myself that were never actually the enemy. The storm didn't transform me. It didn't magically solve anything. It just forced me to stop running long enough to hear what I'd been feeling all along. And once you hear something true, you can't unhear it. You can only decide how you will live with it. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.